In this video, we will be looking at a general overview of how to evaluate a research method in sociology. You're going to need a pen and paper to make notes or a document loaded up on a computer to start typing in. What first attracted Anna Nicole Smith to the billionaire Jay Howard, 62 years her senior? We can apply the general idea of how she used criteria to how a researcher may select a research method or topic. That is, when evaluating specific research methods, we can use a set of criteria to judge that method. Remember, there is no such thing as a perfect method, but also there is never a method that only has drawbacks. We can use the following as a checklist then to help us consider the strengths and limitations of the method applied to the research setting and topic, and the characteristics of the people being studied. When it comes to looking at these specific research methods, you can cover the full range of issues just by recalling this model or tool if you like. Don't forget you can press pause at any time as you make notes of these points in this video. I won't necessarily do the sound effects on each one. But this model, PERVERT, stands for the issues or the criteria which are going to help you to think of things to say in your research methods questions. In a research methods essay, for example, you would be expected to make at least some reference to each of these things. So, without any further ado, we're going to go through this as a general overview of what those things are. So, given the wide range of research methods available, the question of how we select the right one for our research means that we need to think about what the different methods and sources of data are and have with regards to their strengths and their limitations. And we need to be able to evaluate these when selecting which to use. We can look at the strengths and limitations in terms of a number of practical, ethical and theoretical issues. We'll start with P. You don't have to go in this specific order in your essays, but what some people do is they write PERVERT in the margin or on the side of their answer, and then once they've gone through all these issues, they cross them out to say they've done them. So you make sure you've covered each of those issues, and if you do that, you've covered what's referred to as a wide range of factors. So the P in the PERVERT model stands for practical, the general issues to consider. For example, how feasible is this method? I always think a good way of thinking about this is to imagine that you personally have been tasked with doing research and someone said to you you've got to do it using this research method. What specific problems would you encounter? What problems would you specifically find if someone said to you, right, you've got to use this method? But also remember, in terms of the positives, you might want to think about the positive or benefits or opportunities provided for this. So, for example, you might think, oh, that's a really easy method, as well as thinking, oh, I don't know how I'd go about doing that. So I'm not sure if we use the term tramp in a politically correct way, but in this sense it's designed as a reminder of the 5 practical factors that may affect research. This isn't all of them, but it covers the main line of argument here. So time, research topic interest, access, money and personal skills or physical characteristics. So for example, what do you look like? Is that going to affect your ability to do a certain type of research? Now for some of these research methods that we go on to have a look at, it doesn't really matter, or it won't be an issue, so you're not going to talk about it. But you are looking for advantages as well as limitations. Therefore, if you are looking at a certain issue, say take for example cost. Now a method may be relatively inexpensive. In this case, money or lack of money being spent to be precise becomes an advantage of using that method. If a method, for instance, does not take a long time, then that becomes a practical advantage. Clearly some methods take longer than others. It's also worth noting that some methods may be quick to do in the first instance, but then take a long time to collate or analyse afterwards. The E in this model stands for ethics. Ethics refers to moral issues about what is right and wrong, and the moral standards that are worth maintaining. To tighten up our knowledge of this, we use DRIP, D-R-I-P, within E. And this is useful because it reminds us of 4 ethical issues. Again, there are more than this, but if we just want to stick to 4 within DRIP, then we can go with deception, right to withdraw, informed consent, and protection from harm. For each research method, or the research method you get in the question, you have to say if it conflicts with any of these issues. You can say it doesn't as well. For example, you might say this method does not face the ethical issues of deception, say for example, and so on and so forth. So this then becomes a strength. So either way, you're going to have to talk about, if you get a question about a research method, you're going to have to talk about the ethical issues involved when using that method or not. So remember, this at the moment is just a general overview of the criteria. As we go on to look at each method, we will then consider the ethical issues, for example, applied specifically to each method. That is interviews, questionnaires, observations, experiments, and then the use of different types of secondary data. Using the model again, the next letter, R, stands for reliability. This is not under any circumstances to be confused with validity. Every time it is, it causes regular annoyance. Remember, the general term or pattern is that quantitative methods usually have higher levels of reliability because they're easier to replicate and standardise. In this instance, for reliability, you have to learn this definition of reliability. And like we did with ethics, as we go on to look at each specific method, you have to decide whether that method is reliable or not, or how reliable the data generated using that method is. Now, as with all of the other methods, some will have higher or lower levels of reliability than others. But it's crucial that you talk about this in an evaluation of a research method with regards to high or low levels of reliability and why. V. V stands for validity. Validity refers to notions of truth. Is the method likely to uncover what is really going on? If it is true to life and accurate, then we can say that this method produces data that is higher in validity. Please note that there are 2 related issues here that may affect the validity of research. The first is what we refer to as the imposition problem, where the researcher imposes their own ideas, and then what is referred to as the Hawthorne effect, where the presence of the researcher causes some participants to act differently, thereby lowering the validity. We will look at both of these 2 issues in more detail. But remember, for each method, it's really important, vital in fact, to talk about whether each method is valid or not and why. Also note, within each method, some factors will affect the level of validity within it. So it's not the case that all of, say for example, every time someone does a participant observation, it's going to be valid. There might be factors within that participant observation which affect its levels of validity. As with the others, we can talk about how validity relates to other factors. Say, for example, it might relate to practical factors or ethical factors. For instance, your validity and your use of ethics may interplay with each other. But as I say, we'll look at this specifically within each research method. Technically speaking, validity is what's known as a theoretical factor. As with the other criteria, you must learn the definition of validity and apply it to different research methods. As I said at the start of this particular criteria, please do not, the examiner will not be impressed, do not repeat, do not confuse this with reliability. Validity refers to notions of truth. Using this method is the research telling us what's really going on. E. E stands for examples. You should, where possible, provide examples drawn from research to explain or illustrate the points you make. What I don't want you to do, though, is to get too bogged down into simply remembering a study that uses a method. You will get more marks if you use that example, say for example, of a study or an issue or a topic, to develop a strength or limitation rather than just stating it. As you can see here, we've defined ethics. To go on and talk about this in a bit more detail, you could use the example of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment to develop some specific ethical issues. So you would say, in the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, these ethical issues or these ethical factors came into play, and you'd say what they were. If you can't remember the name of a specific study, what you can do is you can use an example of a general topic or issue to develop a point. So even if you can't remember a specific study, for example, if you're writing about questionnaires, I can't think of a sociologist who's used a questionnaire, you can talk about how questionnaires in general are useful for finding out about opinions. You'd say, why are they good for finding out about opinions? But you wouldn't necessarily be needing to refer to a specific sociological study. You could be saying they're useful for finding out about opinions to do with a specific topic and so on. And this gets rewarded as an example if you can't think of a specific study that uses, say, for example, a particular method. The second R in the model refers to representativeness. So the question asked here, do you have to eat the whole cake to know what it tastes like, or do you just need a slice? The issue of representativeness is important when looking at research methods. Can you use the findings from a study based on methods that only asked a small number of people to then make generalisations about a larger group, or even go a step further than the whole population? Typically, large-scale methods that are quantitative tend to be higher in this criteria than qualitative methods. But also note, a method that can be reliable or valid doesn't necessarily mean it's representative. This doesn't necessarily detract from the reliability or validity of that method. It just means it's only reliable or valid in that specific context. Say, for example, you were studying a very small group. What you found out could be valid, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's valid. It's representative of all other groups like that. It's valid for that specific group. Finally, in the model, the T, although perhaps we should refer to the PERVERT model as PERVERT with a capital T, because the important, really vital thing here is T theoretical in some cases, because some reference to positivism and interpretivism is essential when looking at research methods, and that is where the T comes into play. At its most basic level, positivists are generally preferring methods that generate quantitative data, and interpretivists prefer methods that generate qualitative data. This section does lead on to discussions about the link between theory and methods and what we would call the sociology as a science debate. But that is something that is explored in much more detail in your Year 2 sociology. For the time being, just be aware of the basic difference between positivism and interpretivism. In sum, when looking at the practical, ethical and theoretical considerations of strengths and limitations of a research method, you need to think about what those issues are, how and why they are relevant. Are they relevant as strengths? Are they relevant as limitations? How and why? So the first and most basic thing you must do is learn this model, learn what it stands for, learn the definitions, and then practice applying it to specific research methods.